Hey everybody, Zach here, and tonight we're going to be talking all about the individualized education plan process, and we're going to be talking a bit about special education policy. And so let's jump right in. We got our table set before us, and hopefully we'll get some information and some new learning together as we work through this. So let's dive right in. So the goal of this presentation is for participants to develop an understanding of special education that promotes inclusion. And so I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm not trying to describe special education as though is not a continuum of services. We'll talk about that today. But I do want to push on some of those continuums of services and also look at whether or not we're providing the least restrictive environment as a first step to that continuum. And so let's jump right in. So on a bad day, education or our jobs, if we work within special education especially, can feel a bit like this, where we can see like a piece of a picture. We might be able to see a part of an image, but we're not able to really see what the whole entire picture is. Let's talk about this in specifics. So thinking about like an IEP goal or a set of IEP goals that a kid has for a year, we're thinking about, and we're putting all our heart and energy and design into a single year to build that IEP and for that kid to meet the goal. But if we only think about it in terms of that single year, it's like looking at a picture and only focusing on one facet of it, right? We're looking at a transition plan and we're thinking about the needs of that kid as they move into ninth grade. Again, part of the picture, but if we don't pull up and look at the entire picture, we might miss some things. And maybe an initial IEP that a kid has and they're entering into special education. Again, a really important piece of the picture. But if we don't think about the entire thing, then we might miss some things. And so we really want to think about, well, what is the overall design? Whether this kid is in an IEP or has an IEP for their entire educational career, or whether they have an IEP for just a portion of their educational career. It's important for us to think about what the kids need and where the design or the energy is going into this kid's plan, and whether or not it's telling the story that both the student and the parents, and then ultimately us as the team, are trying to tell for this kid or to build for this kid. And so thinking about an IEP, thinking about the big picture of where we're headed, where this student wants to go, what their preferences are in their learning, and thinking of themselves as even an expert learner. The IEP was the original kind of that was the original thought behind it. How do we create success that's individualized for a kid? We're honestly trying to create this for all kids now when we're thinking about UDL, but a special education plan is a really important plan for kids that need it. And so let's look at some of the components of this plan and some big ideas around it. So we want to talk about least restrictive environment, and we want to talk about an individualized education plan. And so let's jump in and we're going to think about least restrictive environment. But before we do, what questions do you have about this little session? Where do you see yourself fitting within the IEP process? Feel free to pause the video and think about it, write it down, draw it out, create a little video yourself where you answer some of these questions. We'll have a few more, but this is our first question for the session. All right, so least restrictive environment, what is it? It's the requirement in federal law that students with disabilities should receive their education to the maximum extent appropriate with their non-disabled peers. We're not trying to remove students from regular classes unless, even with supplementary aids and services, education in regular classes cannot be achieved in a satisfactory way. So I just want to highlight that term, supplemental aids and services. It's right here in my cursor. This is represented with many things. This is accommodations. This even in some cases is modifications. This can be special education, like specialized academic instruction or push and support. But what we really need to think about also within the supplemental aids and services piece is universal design for learning in and of itself. And the things that we learn that might need to be individualized that we can draw from universal design for learning that will support kids on a individualized IEP plans. And so let's talk and think about supplemental aids and services and how are we indeed maximizing, or are we indeed like putting every single supplemental aids and service into an environment to grant access to a kid before we move them out of the environment. I would argue, and many of us would probably agree, that now that we know about UDL, we know that there's still a lot left to do within Tier 1, first best core instruction that would provide access. An IEP is a really formal way to make sure that those supports and services that provide or promote access get placed into the environment. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what should already be there? And even for our kids with disabilities that are on an IEP, how would their needs also inform us about the health of the rest of the system? And so let's look at this a bit by talking about, like, before we change and pull a kid out of a system or out of a classroom, let's think about what about the classroom needs to change in order to promote access. So let's not jump to pulling them out before we change and think about what's happening inside. And then, of course, we do have a continuum of services, from RSP pullout to SDC classrooms to functional skills classes to even center-based programs. But I would wonder, and what I'm concerned about is the fact that we might be pulling kids out of their least restrictive environment before we've provided ample supplementary aids and services. And so just some food for thought moving forward, especially with our UDL lens, where we realize that education really hasn't maximized its ability to be flexible and still meet a singular learning target. It was really neat. I got to sit in a supporting inclusive practices group. We've been working in this group for a number of years out in my district. And they had Kristen Wright out, and she's the director of special education for California. And she pointed this out, and I thought it was just so brilliant. And so I wanted to share it with you. I even tweeted it. So here's my little tweet on my phone. But she said, removal means we start with access. Let me show you what that means. If we're saying that kids are being removed from a general education classroom because it's not appropriate, that assumes that they were in the classroom in the first place, which is a really profound thought, because a lot of times the educational establishments or systems assume or pull kids out or just say, oh, well, we don't treat or support that type of kid in this type of classroom. That actually is going against LRE because of this little word removal. The word removal assumes that kids have been practicing or trying, or we've been working to build systems that allow for them to be supported. And then they're not being successful within those systems. But if we're not getting to a point where it's actually a removal and we're just assuming that they can't make it or they can't cut it, then those systems never have any sort of reason to change. And so I thought it was brilliant. I thought I'd share it with you. I really believe in this that she's representing, and I think that the fact that she's the head of special education, the director of special education for California, just does my heart good. So I'm going to pause it for a second, and then I'll come right, or actually we're good. Let's keep going. All right, so questions. How will knowing about least restrictive environment impact your day? So what about some of these thoughts that I just shared with you are interesting or connect to something that you're working on or some thoughts that you have? Feel free to share those out. All right, so let's go back to looking at that classroom environment and thinking about least restrictive environment, or least restrictive environment. So practices that may change when we think about LRE. So in special education, oftentimes, even in inclusive settings where we have a kid in a classroom, something that might change is hovering versus helping. It might change how we do mainstreaming. It might change how we do peer training within a classroom. It might change how we think about generalization. Let's first talk about hovering versus helping. So if we really value LRE, least restrictive environment, and let's say we have a kid that's in a classroom that is being included, a para hovering with a kid in the back of the classroom and working only with that kid would be an example of this isn't their least restrictive environment. This isn't representative of what a classroom actually is. And so maybe we would design this environment or to train the para to work with multiple kids, but to cycle with the specific kid with an IEP or a disability who needs a specific support on a more frequent basis. But overall, we'd want this para to just be a part of LRE and to serve the entire environment, not just the individual needs of the kid. Now, I know there are times where kids need to have para support and it needs to be more intensive. But the question then that we would ask ourselves is, are we creating plans for fading that para support? Where it might be very intense at the beginning, but then it slowly fades as the kid shows that they're making progress. So eventually we might start like this and then create a plan that gradually walks to a system that looks like this. So if we also think about LRE, least restrictive environment, we would think about even in a separate setting. So let's say we're in an STC class or a functional skills classroom that's still on a regular general education campus. If the kids' days are spent in a different setting and at a different schedule and doing and learning and never experiencing the things of LRE, then why is that? Why wouldn't we want to give kids access to the least restrictive environment, even if they're in a separate setting? So working with a general education teacher and trying to find times for that kid to come out of the STC class and push into the general education setting might not be perfect, but it's a way to start. And it's a way to, again, fade in those services and supports so that we can build a kid's capacity for access. And it's also a great way to condition general education, if I'm honest, because if they only get to experience pushing kids out, saying they're not appropriate, and never get to have and come to grips with the reality that kids need access, then a lot of their practices will never change. And so mainstreaming, if we're thinking about LRE, even in separate settings, we should be thinking about, well, what are the ways that we can push kids in so that they're supported and that it's intentionally designed for success? Peer training. So what this means is, rather than always having the student with a disability supported by a para or a teacher, why not train different kids to know about some different strategies that would be supportive? Meaning training an individual kid or a group of kids, here's how you read out loud to this student, and here's what the student's goal is for the week. Do you think you could ask that question to them? Or do you think you could help them with their understanding? Now, again, I'm not saying that the student within that class replaces the teacher, but I am saying that we can show kids and model for the class how we treat people who learn differently. And we can give kids across the room strategies for being successful. Again, not to target or to highlight or to embarrass. This one is one that you really need to think about how you design it and how you design it well, so that this general education student doesn't feel like they always have to be connected to the special education student. But it is something to think about as we're thinking about LRE. How would we create space within the environment for that kid to be given supports? Their peers might be part of that equation. And then the last thing in thinking about LRE is the power of generalization. So if we're trying to get kids, and this applies even outside of special education, if we're trying to get kids to be able to transfer skills across settings, the best way for them to do that is to actually go into different settings and start practicing those skills. And this is something that's especially important for students with disabilities, because research shows they don't transfer skills. They get compartmentalized, when be able to do things in one spot, in one context, but they can't apply what they learned in that context to other places. By thinking about LRE, thinking about the least restrictive environments that a kid would go into and practice different skills, it really does promote generalization. It promotes those skills becoming stickier and more, and the kid becoming more adaptable to the differences of an environment. So it's a really, really powerful practice, one that we can even design for and put within an IEP goal. Not just that the kid can do simple addition and subtracting, addition and subtraction in like a special education classroom, but writing, the student will be able to add and subtract in 3 different settings. All of that promotes generalization, again, and can be a way to build the LRE into the IEP, which is a lot of letters, I know, but you can build it into the IEP. So now the kid needs access to different settings in order to accomplish their goal. All right, so that was a little talk on the IE or the LRE, the idea of LRE. And so now what we're going to jump into is this process of an IEP. What is an individualized education plan? And let's talk a bit about it. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to design a formal and legally binding plan put in place by an IEP team to support a student towards their own unique needs, right? So whether the kid goes into a work setting and has a life goal of working in an office, whether the kid is staying in school, they're in their early days of elementary, and we're talking about the skills needed in order to be successful there, we really should be thinking about the long-term goals of the student as we design and think through their short-term yearly goals within their yearly IEPs. And so if you never have the question when you're sitting in that IEP with the parent and the student, what are your goals? Like, what do you want to accomplish in your life? Even at young ages, like, it still is important when we think about kids' engagement, thinking about what they care about, what they're interested in. We have to get that story built into their IEP for it to truly be individualized. And so thinking and asking those big questions so that you design a path to meet those goals, even if it's not our preference, even if it's not a path that we would have designed for ourselves. That's the magic of teaching, and that's the magic of a kid starting to become an expert learner, is you're giving them power and autonomy to make decisions that will benefit their life. And then along the way, you're helping to steward that by being kind and giving them feedback and information in the moments where those things will make sense and connect. So a formal and legally binding plan, that's an IEP. So where do you see yourself within the IEP process? It's a question I have. You can pause it if you want. So what is an IEP? Let's look at this in a different way and with a different representation. So here's how I think about an IEP. It's a story of where the student has been, a story of where he is currently, and then a story of where he's going. An IEP is, simply put, it's a legally binding story that we have written that tells the kid the trajectory of a student and tells the success of the student or where the student needs help. And so one piece of this is, okay, so where he is, where he has been, where he is, and where he's going. But the piece that I forgot, honestly, is also what he needs along the way. That's what a good and powerful IEP will tell you. And it should be really clear to every member sitting at that IEP table. If it's not clear to the member with the least experience in education, then it's not a clear IEP. And we as practitioners really need to know that. And we need to own that because we have made inaccessible IEPs for a really long time. And it's time for that to stop, especially if we're universally designed practitioners, right? If we're practitioners that have UDL as our primary lens, then it should really bother us that members of our table are not understanding the content that we're trying to get across, because oftentimes those members are the most important people at the table, thinking of the student and his or her parents. And so where he's been, where he is, where he's going, and what he needs along the way, that should be so clear in a well-written IEP. So previous year's IEPs, those all are ways for you to trace the trajectory. And when you're thinking about a previous year's IEP, right, in their present levels, or when you even look back at their IEP history, we should see goals that connect to each other. Meaning, I should be able to see, okay, the student at this point was learning, had a goal around letter sounds. This point had a goal around blending. And then this year had a goal around fluency. See how those link together to tell a clearer story? Whereas if we had a goal that's like, student will know letter sounds, student will be able to write his name next year, student will be able to answer questions from a book. Maybe those are connected, maybe not, but they should be really clear. And we should have multiple kind of storylines of goals that connect to other goals to build on a plan each and every year. So again, where has he been? Look at the IEPs, the previous year's IEPs, both their annual IEPs and their triennial IEPs and the assessments, to try to figure out what's been the story, what's been tried for this student. Where he is, present levels of performance, right? So if we're thinking about where he is, let's think about the parts of the IEP that communicate that. So you have like I said, the present levels of performance. You have where the student is currently placed, what services they currently receive. You also have any current assessments, whether they be formal, like I said before, triennial assessments, but also informal or classroom assessments. All of those things are admissible and can give a clear bit of information about where the student is. One thing also about assessments is don't forget about your statewide assessments. How the student is scored, whether it be the alternative assessment for a state or just the standard statewide assessment, like in our case, it's the CASP test. Even that we should be paying attention to and looking at, is the kid growing in those statewide assessments? Is the student making yearly progress? So where he is, those are the parts of the IEP that help us with that. And then where he's going. Future goals are awesome here. You can even have glimpses of this in terms of the present levels page when you talk about what a student is inconsistent in or what their needs are, the support needs are, because any of those things should be connected to an IEP goal. So when thinking about where he's going, we need to be thinking about what are the future goals of the student that really will chart that trajectory towards their ultimate foundational goals, where they want to be in their lives. And then the IEP notes themselves, we need to capture great notes that are able to tell that story, where we look at the student's strengths. And I always, when I'm doing or facilitating IEPs, it's actually not directly from me. It's something we've been doing out in my district for a long time. We always start with strengths, and we always build and go around the table building a big bank of what a student's strengths are, what things they've grown in, where they should go and want to go within the IEP. And then within the IEP notes, we talk about concerns. What are the areas of need that the student is displaying? And then we lastly talk through outcomes. So what are the changes? What are the things that are going to really clearly state where the student is going for this IEP? And then the last thing, what he needs along the way. These are the parts of the IEP that tell the special factors, the services, the supplementary aids, right? All of those things that we build into the IEP that say, in order for this student to be successful, here are the things we've tried that have worked. And even in the notes, you can write things that we've tried that have not worked. But clearly and very specifically communicated within the IEP should be those accommodations, the special factors, the services, and the supplementary aids. And just as a side note, I'm going to pause here and make a UDL connection. If the student or within your IEPs, I wouldn't be afraid to be using some of the language of UDL to say the student needs a multimedia representation when they're first learning a new concept. The student needs to be able to given the ability or the choice to use their voice when expressing their understanding. Because if you're in a district that's using UDL, you can use the language of UDL within the IEP, and that helps both sides, the general education practitioner and the special education practitioner, to speak the same language. Because oftentimes our general education counterparts, when they're in an IEP, they feel lost. They feel like they don't belong. They feel like there's no reason for them to be there. And nothing could be further from the truth. So if we can start using some common language, and if we're all using the language of UDL, why not put some specifics around how the accommodations promote access within engagement, representation, action, expression? It's powerful stuff. And it creates not only access for a student, but also bonds you to general education. And it helps create access for you to that general education teacher. So what is an IEP meeting? What should it look like? You have your annual IEP. So that's what happens every single year. And it's very, very important you stick with your timelines. So you can't have it go a day after that yearly date of when your last IEP was. You can do it earlier, but you can't do it later. You have your triennial IEP. So every 3 years, where you assess the student to make sure that they are being qualifying for special education under the disability categories. Oftentimes, it's really important for you to do to think through and really make sure that the student is qualifying for the right reasons, because sometimes you can get IEPs from out of district or out of state, and different practitioners have different levels of quality with how they assess. And so it's really important, especially when you get new students to your district, that you know and assess well. You also have your initial IEP, so the first IEP for a student to really lay out how they're qualifying for special education and what their services, goals, and supports are. And then you have an interim IEP, and this is one that I kind of talk through. But when you have a transfer student from a different district, from out of state, you have a little window of time where you're going to keep the services of their IEP that they come with. And then you can either assess or decide this IEP is well written and we'll continue with it. But this interim IEP, these are the different types of IEPs that you might run into. So it's important to think about that IEP team and that IEP meeting in order to promote success. So first and foremost, you should be considering, you should be having parents of the IEP. They have to be there legally because they have to sign it. And so the fullest and with the most kind of creativity, because I know that there's been times where, at least even in my experience, where it was so tough to get a parent to the meeting. You got to go through it because it's not about you and the parent's relationship. It's about what the IEP means for the kid and how important it is. So you absolutely need to fight to have those parents there. You need to have the student at the IEP because this is all about them. And we had students at IEPs, we really, really want them there as young as an age as appropriate because we need them to understand what the IEP is and eventually to take ownership of the IEP should that be appropriate. And it's so powerful. Everybody leans in when the kid is taking ownership of the IEP because it becomes like this example, this powerful example of what it's all about. And the kid, we don't have to say anything. Everybody gets it because they see the kid leading the meeting. Special education teacher should be at the IEP. Service provider, and so speech and language path, your physical therapist, your OT or APE teacher, school psychologists, district representatives. So this is the person, whether it be, a lot of times it's a principal, but they're representing the local education agency and making sure that any sort of services that are promised can actually be carried out. It's a really important person to have at the table. They also have to sign off saying that they agree. GE teacher, other. It's really open who considered the IEP. You just need to talk to the parents beforehand, make sure everybody is aware of who's at the IEP and comfortable with who's at the IEP. For sure, the people that you must have are the parent, the district representative, someone from general education, the special education representative, all must be present at the IEP. One thing I'm going to talk about with the general education teacher, we are not serving, so I'm talking from a special education lens, we're not serving our general education counterparts well at IEPs right now. Just want to be honest. They oftentimes are feeling lost and like it's a waste of time. Their role is to really provide a glimpse of what least restrictive environment is for that IEP and for that team. And so you need to, if you're the special education teacher or if you're the district representative, ask that teacher, okay, here are the goals that we've set out. Do these goals seem appropriate? Do they seem like they would stair step or be good prerequisites to standards-based instruction? Do you realize how honoring that is for a general education teacher? First off, just to be given, hey, here's your role. Here's what I'd like you to share about at this IEP. But then it's also so important because the team needs to know what LRE looks like. And the GE teacher, that's what they live. They live the least restrictive environment. And so it's profoundly important to have them at the meeting, but also to include them in the process because they have an area of expertise that honestly we don't have as special education teachers. We are so focused on case managing and supporting kids who learn differently that we oftentimes, if we're left to our own devices, we'll forget about the standard. And I'm talking about this as a special education teacher because I did this. I would oftentimes, cut corners or forget that it is about the standard. It should be about access to that standard-based instruction because that is what we're saying is fair and protects the student from that whole idea of separate but not equal. And so Very important, especially if we're serving kids that are in a continuum of service and they're not currently being served in a general education classroom. It's even more important that we have a GE teacher there to provide feedback for us on what LRE looks like. And so, could you go to an IEP? Absolutely. And you should. Even if you're not a case manager, make sure you talk about it beforehand. Talk to the case manager if you're not the primary case manager. Observe the IEP first. Don't say anything, right? And so I'm thinking if you're someone that doesn't attend IEPs often, you can absolutely go. Make sure that you're making everyone aware. Pay attention to how the team first is talking about the needs of the student. And then, based on that, make sure your language is positive. Use positive language about a student's strengths. Use positive language about where the areas of growth are, and positive languages about what you believe a student can accomplish. Because it's so incredibly empowering when a parent hears a teacher say and positive things about their student, and it's so incredibly like dehumanizing, frustrating, and heartbreaking when the people you're sending your kids to say that they believe that your kid will never accomplish certain things. So you got to be so careful about what you say. So Joelle is very low and can't count past 10. Instead of saying stuff like that, right? So never call a kid low. It's not actually a helpful word to say. Be specific. Fine, he can't count past 10. So here's another way to say it. Joel has a challenge with counting. He can count to 10 though, which is an area to build from. See how I said the same exact thing, but I said it in a way that's empowering for Joel and his parents. And I said it in a way that says like a growth mindset and models a growth mindset within the IEP. Knowing what a kid can do is so much more helpful than knowing and just hearing only what they can't do. A kid can't read. Great. But that doesn't give me any sort of starting place to know what things and where to begin in their reading and designing a plan for their reading. So instead of saying just this kid can't read, what can they do? Can they orient to the page even? All of that helps us in building plans that meet kids where they are and then builds where they want to go. So really important what we say. So question, how does knowing more about the big picture of special education help you better accomplish the day-to-day work of special education? Talk about it, type it up. This is something I'd love for you if this was an option you chose for the discussion. Bring this up in your discussion so that we can hear more about it. All right, everyone, that was our presentation. Reminder of the goal, participants will develop an understanding of special education that promotes inclusion. Hopefully that happened for you in these past 30 so minutes. Thanks again for your patience. This week is moving week, so I'm barely hanging on, but I'm happy to be here and so encouraged by how you're participating within our course.